I'm going to time myself. Alright, just start whenever. Okay, so my name is Kenny Summer, and I'm here refuting Christopher's claim that esports is just as much sports as traditional sports. He attempts to prove this by showing us that esports fit the definition of a sport, that professionals of esports follow strict training regimes, and that at the professional level, how good you are is based solely on skill and not on age. So Christopher began his argument by defining what a sport is. He says that a sport is an activity involving physical exertion and skill in which an individual or team competes against another or others for entertainment. So, if you go on Google and you type in define sport, this is the definition it gives you. So I decided to look at another definition. This one I found from the Webster's New World Dictionary. It defines a sport as any activity or experience that gives enjoyment or recreation. So a sport, that's a very general definition for a sport, and I feel like anything could really be a sport under that definition. Playing guitar could be a sport, but we wouldn't regard it as a traditional sport. And esports are even called esports. We put sport in the name. So I don't think there's any really controversy over whether they are sports or not. It's just that the claim is that they should be regarded just as much sports as traditional sports, so I don't think that arguing that they are sports is relevant to advancing the claim. The second point he tries to make is proving his claim. He next tries to prove his claim by describing the strict training regimes of the athletes. He argues that professional gamers' training is year-round with rarely any breaks, in contrary to traditional sports where after the season ends there might be like a gap where they're not training as hard. They get like a little break off before the preseason. So, so the Patriots won the Super Bowl last year, February 1st, and began officially practicing April 20th. So that's about 7 weeks of rest. They need that rest because their training is a lot more physically demanding than those of people in esports. These professional athletes of traditional sports can't just sit around being lazy during that 7 weeks rest period either. They can't. They have to stay in shape. They have to work out still and eat healthy. They can't just sit around being lazy, eating ice cream, watching television, and playing video games all day. And during the off season and through season, professional athletes of traditional sports are put through a strict training regime that is far more physically demanding than professional gamers. So esports athletes may put in more hours of work total, but the athletes in traditional sports can't practice constantly. They have to sleep and rest their bodies. Finally, Christopher argues for his claim by telling us that esports has varying leagues of play like traditional sports, but does not discriminate by age like traditional sports. He uses the example of Sumaya El, I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, but he's the 15-year-old esports athlete with over $1.5 million in tournament winnings. Many traditional sports have 0 professional athletes that are teenagers, so this fact further distinguishes the two, which is the opposite of what his claim would suggest. He also brings up a player that missed out on a tournament due to tennis elbow. Injuries occur from a wide range of activities. Just getting an injury doesn't exactly mean that, it's not like you just get injuries from sports. There's injuries that occur from everything. And maybe he was trying to compare this to sport because it is called tennis elbow, and tennis is considered a traditional sport. So maybe that was the comparison he was trying to make. But after looking into tennis elbow, I found that you can get tennis elbow from a variety of activities, including tennis, and then according to WebMD, it can also be caused by painting, weightlifting, and typing, which aren't sports activities. Maybe weightlifting kind of to train for your sport. And tennis elbow is also the most common reason people see doctors for elbow pain, and occurs primarily in people at age 40. Therefore, tennis elbow is not an injury related solely to sports and does not support the claim. So, in conclusion, Christopher supported his claim that esports are just as much sports as traditional sports by showing that esports athletes train longer with less physical exertion, and that the professional scene is based off of skill without age playing a role. I'm not convinced that these are requirements of something being regarded as a traditional sport, and coming up with a clear definition of what makes a traditional sport is tricky. And I've tried to think of a good definition too. I think there's a lot more to it than just a clear definition of what makes a traditional sport. I feel like it's a lot based on cultural opinion. We have to accept video games as a competitive, professional, sporting scene, which most people do not. most people actually consider it laughable to think of a video game as a traditional sport. So most people do not accept it, which leaves the burden of proof on Christopher for trying to prove that it is a traditional sport. And he's failed to convince me otherwise. And I hope that I've convinced all of you that he did not give enough evidence to support his claim.
You're going to hand me that outline, right?
Yeah.
Excuse me. Well, you identify the main proposition and the secondary points pretty well. But in essence, you seem to be conceding an awful lot in that first section where you talk about the definition of sports, and then you provide a definition that's even broader than the one the advocate presented. So your argument comes down to the notion that either there's no argument here about it being a sport, or that the real dispute is about whether or not it fits a definition of sport that is acceptable to the viewing public, for instance, on ESPN, or what people might accept as being a sport. I think there's a good way to kind of diminish the argument, and you do a little bit of that in some of your arguments. So, for example, on the second point, when you're talking about the training regime, I think you do explain the difference between traditional athletic competitions and the kinds of training that they undergo versus the ones that the esports people do. And the notion that it's not the amount of time that's involved, but that it is, in fact, a physical process. I think that's one of the things that you might want to use in your argument about it being not a traditional sport. I do think that you have a good point, although you kind of back away from it, by saying, look, they call it esports for a reason, that there's a distinguishing characteristic here, that it's not the same as traditional sports because it is done electronically, typically online, and the physical involvement is minimal. It's hand-eye coordination entirely, and that's like cup stacking is hand-eye coordination, and we wouldn't think of that as being a traditional athletic competition. So I think that there are arguments to be made here that diminish the argument, and you get to some of them, but you also back away from them a little bit. The whole thing about the league discriminating about the different ages that are going on there, I'm not sure why that either benefits the advocate's position or why your position is enhanced by denying it. How does that demonstrate that it is a so-called real sport, or that it constitutes some kind of contest that we would want to put on the same platform with other kinds of sports? I'm not sure. You kind of go along with the idea that there aren't any professionals who are in their teens on doing this. No, I would suspect that if you dug into it a little bit, you would discover that there are a number of golfers, especially women golfers of young age, tennis players, same sort of thing, who are pretty damn young, who get involved in this and often make millions of dollars. So I'm not exactly sure that that's the criteria either, but I'm not sure, like I said, why getting into that either direction helps either side in the argument. I think you just take a counter position that way. I like the argument about the tennis elbow. In essence, you're saying the notion that people get tennis elbow is not a way to indicate that this is in fact a sport, equivocating it with, tennis. Oh, see, it's the same kind of injury that you get doing that. And I thought you had some interesting examples there. I think you could use a little bit of evidence to back that sort of thing up. You said you found that you can get it from those sorts of things, but I didn't hear a source citation on that, and I thought that was a little bit problematic too. All right, thank you.